In Chapter 35, we'll take a look at behavioral adaptations to the environment. This is one of my favorite chapters because I study animal behavior and find it fascinating. 4 major sections in this chapter that we'll look at. We'll look at the scientific study of behavior, learning, how behavior influences survival and reproductive success, and then we'll look at social behavior and sociobiology. In Part 1, we're going to look at the scientific study of behavior. Behavior can encompass a wide range of activities. Behavior is just an action that's carried out by muscles or glands that are under the control of the nervous system, and it's a response to some sort of environmental cue. Something happens in the environment, there might be some signal that another animal is sending, and then the recipient of that signal responds to it by perhaps going towards the signal, going away from the signal, and so we would refer to that as their behavior. Collectively, if we look at an organism's behavior, it's really all of their responses to both those external cues that we just mentioned, but also to internal cues. Motivation is something that changes our behavior. Our internal hunger level can influence the way we respond. Different hormonal levels can change the way an organism responds at one time or another. So it's a combination of these internal and external cues that drives that behavior. When we look at behavioral ecology, we're looking at behavior in an organism's natural environment, and we're studying it from an evolutionary context. So we're asking about how that particular behavior evolved in that particular environment. When we look at behavioral ecology, we often will look at 2 fundamentally different types of questions: proximate and ultimate questions. Proximate questions are the more immediate questions. Proximate means closer to. And what that means is, how does that behavior occur? How does the organism accomplish it? What is the stimulus that's triggering the behavior? What is the neural mechanism, the physiological basis of the response? We might be looking at the anatomical mechanisms, the muscles that are responding to it. We might be looking at the genetics and the development of this particular behavior. We're really asking, how does the animal accomplish this? What are the underlying genetic, physiological mechanisms that allow this behavior to occur? Once again, it's really looking at questions about the immediate cause of the behavior. The ultimate questions look more at the why of a particular behavior. Why does the animal respond in this way to this particular stimulus? This can have a couple of different pieces to it. One is the adaptive value. What that basically means is, how is it that this particular behavior increases the survival and reproduction of the organism performing the behavior? That's looking at that adaptive value. We also can look at the evolutionary history of the behavior. Ultimate questions both tie into evolution, both through natural selection and the adaptive value of the behavior, and also that evolutionary history. For instance, if I look at a particular organism and I'm looking at their social behavior, they interact with others of their own species in a long-term way, and they communicate and they behave socially. I also might then ask about their ancestors. Were their ancestors also social? Do they have this social behavior because they got it from a common ancestor, or did they evolve it independently after they split from that ancestor? And so we can ask questions about how selection is working on a particular behavior and what is the evolutionary history of it in terms of their ancestry. These look more at evolutionary explanations. So we've got the mechanistic types of explanations, which are proximate, and then the evolutionary ones, which are ultimate. Some behaviors are what we refer to as innate or instinctive. Konrad Lorenz and Nico Tinbergen first demonstrated this idea of innate behavior. These are behaviors that are essentially under very strong genetic control, and when the organism performs it, they typically perform it in a very stereotypical fashion. So pretty much all individuals of the species will perform it in a very similar way. It may not be identical, but it'll be very similar. It also typically is a type of behavior that once it starts, it goes to completion. This is an egg retrieval kind of behavior. If they're sitting on a nest and one of the eggs rolls away, they'll roll it back. What you'll find in experiments is that if this behavior starts, and let's say we remove the stimulus here, we remove the egg, in many cases the bird will continue that behavior even though the stimulus is now gone. It's typically one that will kind of get performed to completion even if it seems irrelevant or inappropriate at the time. It also is typically something that is done correctly the first time that it's performed. So there's not really a learning component to it. Now, Nico Tinbergen and Lorenz also came up with this concept of fixed action patterns. And that's really just to describe sort of a very stereotypical type of behavior that is the response to a very specific stimulus. As we said before with these innate behaviors, typically in a fixed action pattern, once it's initiated, it will be performed all the way through, regardless of changing those circumstances. A lot of reproductive behaviors would be fixed action patterns, and these are typically, again, things that have to be done correctly the first time, otherwise they could be life-threatening. We don't have to learn these types of innate fixed action pattern behaviors. And behavior is the result of both genetic and environmental factors. Some behaviors may have a stronger genetic component than others, and then some may have a stronger environmental component. Years ago, this was kind of referred to as the nature versus nurture controversy. Nature being the genetic piece, nurture being the environmental component. We now know that most behavior is a combination of those two things, and they interact with one another. But we have, using molecular genetics, been able to start to isolate some specific genes that control behavior. Experiments on fruit flies have led to discovery of genes controlling learning, memory, internal clocks, and some courtship and mating behaviors. We have an example here of a particular gene that influences courtship behavior. The gene is called fruitless. In normal males that have the normal version of the gene, they court the female as they normally would. If a male has a mutated copy of this fruitless gene, instead of courting females, he courts males. When they take the gene and genetically alter a female, introducing that gene to a female, that female then expresses that gene by courting females. So we see a single gene mutation can have a big influence on this courtship behavior, which clearly would have a huge impact on their overall reproductive success and contribute to the evolution of their behavior. We also know that some of the genes that govern fruit fly behavior have very similar counterparts in mice and humans. In many cases, we'll find that it's the exact same gene or slightly modified version of that gene that's also influencing that behavior in such organisms as mice and humans. Finding similarity in genes between organisms as different from one another as fruit flies, mice, and humans represents something known as a deep homology. It means it's something that goes very far back in the evolutionary history, and it really points to that deep level of connectedness that we have in the genetics of these organisms. And it's interesting that something as pliable as behavior shows some of those deep homologies. Recall that when we think about an organism's phenotype, we know that the phenotype depends on the environment, and it also depends on the genes, and it depends on the interaction between those two things. In some cases, it might be diet interacting with the genetic makeup, and that might trigger things like the progression of disease, the onset of cancer. In some cases, part of that environmental exposure also has to do with social interactions with other organisms. It's not just the physical environment that can change the way genes are expressed, it's also the social environment. In some organisms, the environment can determine something like the sex of the organism. In many reptiles, instead of them having sex chromosomes that determine the sex, it's determined by temperature. Eggs that are raised at one temperature become males. Eggs that are raised at another temperature become females. Typically, within a nest, there's going to be a temperature variation, so that within that nest, you'll have some males and some females. But that gives us a good example of how the environment can really influence the phenotypic expression of traits. Now let's take a look at this with respect to behavior. One of the things that we can do in behavior to try to understand and to tease apart the difference between an environmental component that's influencing the behavior and the genetic component is to do what is called a cross-fostering experiment. In a cross-fostering experiment, you would essentially take either a clutch of eggs or a litter of offspring, and you would separate them and leave some of them with their biological parent and then give some of them to an adoptive parent. And then that way we can look for differences between those two groups and ask how much of the difference that we see between them is due to the fact that they're biologically related to one another, or does it have to do with the fact that they're being raised in different environments. environments. So if I put them in different environments, but they still all grow up to be identical, then it would be biological. If I put them in different environments and they grow up, the ones raised by mom are very, very different than the ones raised by the adoptive parent, then I would say that there was a lot of environmental component to the development of that behavior. Some studies on rats have shown that we can not only influence the immediate expression of a trait, but some of that can actually be passed to future generations. This is something we refer to as epigenetics, where we take something that is in the environment and it influences that organism by modifying aspects of their genetics. It doesn't modify their actual DNA, but it can change the way that that DNA is expressed. It can change histones and other things that are sort of wrapping around the DNA, changing that gene expression. In many cases, those epigenetic factors then can be transmitted from one generation to the next. Years ago, they always thought that we stripped those things off and that when we went to make egg and sperm, those epigenetic factors had been removed and they wouldn't go from one generation to the next. Well, now we realize that some of those epigenetic factors do stay on the genome and they can be transmitted from one generation to the next. This study looked at how interaction with mom influences later development in the pup's life. We have a high interaction mom, so mom is interacting with her offspring a lot, and then we have a low interaction mom over here where she does not interact with them. Now, if we just look at those two sets of pups, we'll find out that the pups over here with the high interaction mom grow up to be relaxed adults. The ones that are with a low interaction mom grow up to be very fearful as adults. So then they wanted to ask the question about whether or not it was the way they were treated or just the fact that these are from this particular mom and they're going to have a gene for being fearful. They take some of the pups and rear them with the other parent. The ones that are reared over here with the high interaction mom, irrelevant of where of their parentage, became relaxed as adults. The ones over here that were raised by the low interaction mom became fearful. This would suggest that it's the interaction that is modifying the behavior as they grow up. We'll take a look at a video that describes this classic experiment on moms licking their pups and the overall effect that this has.
Fact of the day.
Fact of the day.
Hello, hi, and welcome to Fact of the Day with me, Mark Lotsu, licking rat babies. This is an interesting study and it's based around epigenetics. Epigenetics is a study of a change in an organism's behavior based around modification of gene expression as opposed to actually altering the genes themselves. So you're not changing the genes, you're just changing how they're expressed. So some scientists, I'm not sure what they were doing with their life, but they just saw some mother rats licking baby rats, and at a later point in time they thought, oh, these baby rats seem to be exhibiting different behaviours to these other baby rats which were licked differently. So they've got high licking and low licking mothers, and the high licking mothers are the ones that lick the babies lots and lots and lots, and the low licking mothers hardly lick the baby rats at all. And what they found was the offspring of mothers who lick the babies a lot tend to be much more calmer, much less aggressive, and don't tend to exhibit strange or abnormal sexual behaviour. Whereas the babies whose mothers didn't lick them a lot tend to be more aggressive and exhibit abnormal, stranger sexual behaviour. So they did an experiment where they fostered these babies out to high licking mothers and low licking mothers. So basically what you do is you take a baby who is from a high licking mother, and then when that's grown up and then she has babies of her own, those babies are given to a low licking mother. And the baby from a low licking mother, when she's grown up and she has babies of her own, her baby is given to a high licking mother. So they're fostered out. So there's no link in terms of the genes. And what they found is exactly as I've explained. High licking mothers, less stressed, less aggressive babies when they're older. Low licking mothers, more aggressive babies when they're older, and different sexual behaviours. So it wasn't a biological mother that determined behaviour in the baby rats, is actually the foster parents, the foster mother. So it showed us a sequence of biochemical events triggered by the mother licking the baby, which cause a change in the expression of the DNA of the genes, which led to a change in the rat's behaviour when they were older. So this is thought to be linked to humans in terms of expression of love. So with babies and children, when they're shown lots of genuine love as babies and as they grow up, things like physical affection, reassurance, they're thought to become much calmer and much more relaxed. Whereas if they're denied love, if they're denied genuine love or physical affection, they become much more aggressive and have a much shorter fuse. So what's the end result? The end result is give more love. It doesn't matter if you're genetic related or not. Give more love. It always helps. That is Licking Rat Babies. Thanks so much for watching. Love you, bye. Love you, bye. Love you, bye.